I feel like as women, we're not we're not socialized to talk about these things because there's so much ableism in seeing things like autism or ADHD as a deficit rather than as a superpower or as just a way of thinking.
You're listening to episode 45 of the Happy Space podcast, and today we're exploring what it's like to get a late diagnosis of autism with highly creative, autistic self advocate Melanie Deziel. Welcome to the Happy Space podcast, where productivity meets inclusivity and everyone gets things done. Hello, I'm Clare Kumar, highly sensitive executive coach, speaker, and your host. Studies show that diversity leads to better business outcomes. So doesn't it make sense to invite everyone's richest contribution? Yet too many people are invited to burn out or opt out, and we are squandering talent. On this show, we'll explore a two-part solution. Part 1, cultivating sustainable performance, the individual design of work and life to preserve our energy so we can keep contributing. And 2, designing inclusive performance, the design of spaces, cultures, products, and services which invite the richest participation. I hope you enjoy these conversations and find inspiration and encouragement, for everyone deserves a happy space. Today's guest, Melanie Deziel, and I connected at a gorgeous conference of epic entrepreneurs and forward thinkers as we looked for what every highly sensitive person wants in a busy, noisy place, a quieter place to talk. One of the things we spoke about in our conversation was her late autism diagnosis and how this has profoundly influenced her life today. I knew right away that she would have incredible insights to share on the Happy Space podcast, and I'm so happy she joined me. As a highly sensitive person, I've long been curious about this blurry line between autism and high sensitivity, and really wanted to dig into and get a better understanding of what that might be. Well, you'll hear as Melanie and I talk about many things that resonated deeply with me, her perspectives on, is there a blurry line or isn't there? What does an autism diagnosis do for you, if anything? So much to explore. And I want you to know that so much resonated with me so deeply. If you want a real interesting listen to this podcast, then you will visit the YouTube channel and watch it there, because I can tell you one thing, I am no poker face. Melanie is a two-time author, acclaimed speaker, and marketing expert, and most recently, autistic self-advocate. You can find Melanie's most recent writing today at the Late Diagnosed Diary on Substack. I had numerous insights during our conversation, and I'm curious if you might too. Hey, Melanie, I'm so thrilled you're joining the Happy Space podcast today.
I'm so glad to be here.
We've known each other for a little while now, and what I love about how we connected is we were at an event and it's kind of loud, and we realized we wanted to have a really deep and meaningful conversation. So we
Mhm.
found a quiet place to talk, and we really got to know each other. And I just have to say, I've been thrilled to be in your sphere for a few years now,
Yeah.
and to be bringing your experience to the listeners in the Happy Space podcast. The mission is to stop the squandering of human potential through respecting neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And what I would love to start with, Melanie, is a question for you about how you got to where you are, understanding that autism is part of your life. What was
Yeah.
the journey like?
So I am what we would call a late diagnosed autistic. So um, I spent my entire life truly not having any idea that I was autistic and dealing with the struggles of that, right? And having no idea why, assuming that I was lazy, rude, antisocial, all these other negative stereotypes that kind of get applied to you when you don't have that self-understanding that you can share with others about why your mind works the way it does. It wasn't until I was 31. I started to get served content. I was spending a lot of time on TikTok in the early pandemic, and I started, I joke that the algorithm diagnosed me more than anything. I started to get served content about being an introvert, which led to being highly sensitive, which led to content about being autistic. And I thought, well, that's not something I've ever thought about really. And my understanding of autism at that time didn't line up with myself because as society, we've been fed the version of autism that shows up in, prepubescent boys who like train schedules, right? Like that's the idea we've been given. But I found that the more I started to do research, the more I realized that autism presents in a very different way for girls and for women, and that I was in fact textbook, autistic woman as an adult. So I went and then pursued more formal diagnosis. Been working with a therapist who is neurodivergent affirming, who has experience with autistic women. And the last few years have just been so incredible for me to get to know myself in a way that I never could have before, to understand myself more deeply, and to give myself so much more grace and kindness because I now understand why I think the way I think, why I do the things I do, and it allows me to really be myself more fully because now I understand myself, and it's a gift that I hope I hope that we can give to many other women who may not realize that they're in that same boat.
Mm. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm very curious because I've identified myself to be a highly sensitive person.
Yeah.
And the line between autism and high sensitivity seems to be, to me, very blurry. And as I reflect on my own life of
Hmm.
areas where I've been very direct, very outspoken, see it, speak it, probably be considered rude at times. I've wondered where I am in this, but all my
Yeah.
reading about autism has kind of pushed me more in the towards high sensitivity. And
Yeah.
but I'm really curious when you say that it's different for men and women. Can you share a little bit more about why maybe I'm
Yeah.
identifying with some of the challenges that you're that you're talking about?
100%. Well, one of the things that's really interesting is that people think of the autism spectrum, and many times the thought is like, that's how autistic you are, right? Like, not very or very. But in
Right.
actuality, it's binary. You are or you are not. The spectrum refers to the vast ways in which it can present itself. So there are autistics who are completely nonverbal, who are not able to use spoken language. There are also autistics like myself that are hyperlexic, that are into languages, that can easily pick up languages, that write and read early. So there's that vast spectrum. And the same is true when it comes for other sensory experiences. There are some autistics who, love loud sounds that need that to sort of drown out the inner buzz. And there are some, like me, and maybe like yourself, right, where we don't like those loud sounds. I'm the noise canceling headphone variety. And so all those experiences can go in different directions. And what we find is that with women, it tends to be more of the hyperlexic. So we tend to be, the girls in with the noses in the books, the girls who are super present at school, teacher's pet sort of things, rather than being disruptive in class or being, maybe dealing with some nonverbal elements. We tend to be on the other side. It's of course not universal, and I want to be super clear that having any one of these things, I am not implying or saying that you do have autism, but rather it's the degree to which these things affect you, and the frequency with which they affect you, right? The example I like to give is, everyone has, I'm just going to go super basic physiological needs, right?
Mm,
Everybody gets hungry sometimes, right? You're hungry. You eat food, you feel better. Now, if you were hungry all the time, more frequently than others, that would probably be a problem. If you were hungry to an intensity that it disrupted your ability to exist on a regular basis and you became completely inconsolable, that would also be a problem. So thinking of the symptoms and the presentations that way is sometimes helpful to say, yes, everyone gets uncomfortable in social situations
mhm,
sometimes. Yes, everyone perhaps says something that accidentally offends someone sometimes, but it's the frequency and the degree that it often affects differently, right, when you're autistic.
mhm,
But for women, a big part of it is socialization. So you think of, if I were to say, do you remember the horse girl that was in your class? The girl who was obsessed with horses?
mm.
every class had a horse girl, every class had a,
Yes.
a boy band girl, but those are socially acceptable hyperfixations. Those are socially acceptable special interests. If a boy shows up obsessed with train schedules or breeds of dinosaurs, a red flag goes up. But when a girl knows everything about horses or every fact about a boy band, it's a socially acceptable thing and doesn't raise those same alarms. So a lot of it is the socialization, the same behavior. I see. Are you having an
Having some
epiphany?
reflections happening. Yes. For those who are listening, I'm making all kinds of weird faces to Melanie in the video. If you're watching on YouTube, you've seen it. And this is maybe one of the things. I am no poker player, right?
Mm-mm.
Something comes through my
You could see
brain
it.
and it comes either out my mouth or on my face. I
Hmm.
so yeah. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you with my
No, totally fine. And
reaction.
and please do stop me because I'll go on all day. So
Well, it's fascinating because I'm thinking back to people I know,
hmm
people with ADHD diagnosis,
hmm
for example,
hmm
and I'm thinking back to, you said dinosaur fascination, and I was,
hmm
wait a minute.
hmm
I reflect on my own. Well, there was an inundation of dinosaurs in grade 3 and grade 4 in the curriculum, but
hmm
some people loved it and hooked in, and other people are like, "Oh yeah, that's nice, next."
Yeah, cool.
But yeah, but there was one particular dinosaur fascination in my own life and family that really came back, and I thought, "Well, that's interesting."
It's a perfect example, right, of the frequency and the degree, right? Again, everyone has hobbies, everyone has interests, but
Mm,
usually when we're talking about, a special interest, which has been called obsessions in the past or a hyperfixation, it goes to just a different level. So my
yeah.
grade school example is we learned about World War II. And
Mhm.
everybody had that moment of like, oh, we're learning about this period of history. You read Anne Frank, you learn about the fashion of the times, and you maybe have that moment. I got my entire class to put on a play about World War II. We made up songs. There was a nursing station with a doll where we were performing period accurate first aid. Like, that's not a normal degree of interest, right? It goes beyond the typical.
Yeah, yeah. Which is why associated with this incredibly deep thinking and
Hmm.
processing about it, we have people like Temple Grandin who have
Hmm.
written numerous works,
Yes.
understanding humans, understanding a relationship to animals, understanding
Yeah.
animals' relationship to their senses and the world, right? We need
Yeah.
that deep thinking. So one thing
Absolutely.
I love to celebrate and where I really wanted to have you on is, I mean, a couple of things. One is the saying, when you know someone with autism, you know someone with autism. You don't
Hmm.
understand the full thing. So
Yeah.
I wanted people to hear your particular experience. I think it's these
Yeah.
stories that really bring and start to color in our perceptions of what it is. Um, and that's really why I thought this is really important to have. But you're such
Yeah.
an articulate, I mean, the thinking is there, but then you're able to create and express yourself in such an articulate and effective way as a speaker, as an
Hmm.
author. So I want to point, there's 2 books back on this, on the behind Melanie, for those who are
Yeah.
watching. Maybe I'll get you to just say what the 2 books are, and then we'll talk a little bit about, we'll correlate that to how autism shows up for you, how it
Hmm.
shows up as a strength. And then
Yeah.
maybe we'll get into, how that connects for people looking to understand how they show up and what they need to look for. Today's episode of the Happy Space podcast is sponsored by ClareKumar.com. With sensitivity, curiosity, and courage, I serve 3 groups asking the tough questions that lead to meaningful answers. Number 1, I coach ambitious leaders to design for well-being and achieve next-level work-life integration. Number 2, I mic drop thought bombs. That's bombs as in BALMS, in keynotes and workshops, helping organizations achieve the business imperative that is inclusivity. And 3, I collaborate with brands concerned with respect for well-being on product design, marketing, and PR. If any of this piqued your interest, come find me at clarekumar.com. I'd love to speak with you. Designing inclusive performance together will lead to the richest results.
100%. Yeah. So the 2 books here over my shoulder are The Content Fuel Framework, which was my first book. And it's really the system that I use internally to come up with content ideas. I frequently work in the marketing space, helping people come up with blog ideas, video ideas, things like that. And the question I was getting all the time is like, well, where do these ideas come from? Like, where are you coming up with this stuff? And when I didn't know the answer, that bothered me immensely. So I spent months trying to deconstruct it and figure out what was happening automatically for me. How could I figure out what that was to teach it to others? So that's the process that's inside the Content Fuel framework.
So be
And
careful what you ask, right?
yes,
Because, right, you set up a
because,
question, all of a sudden, that could be the next thing, and I
well,
relate to that deep curiosity. Like,
yeah.
as a child, were you just intensely addicted to learning?
100%. And I still am. I still am. I
Yeah,
always struggle. And you may relate to this as well. I struggle when people ask me what my hobbies are because my hobbies are reading and watching documentaries. And people are like, that's not a hobby. What do you mean? And I'm like,
and
no, that's 100% my hobby. I
right?
love learning new things. Like
Yeah.
maybe that makes me a nerd. I don't know. I don't care.
My book club knows
That,
to expect a nonfiction recommendation from me
hmm.
because the
Yep.
learning piece, maybe we can do a biography because that's kind of
Yeah.
nonfiction learning too, right? So,
Yeah.
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 So, okay. So back to your, that
Yeah.
was the first book. And what's the second
Mhm.
book?
The second one is called Prove It, Exactly How Modern Marketers Earn Trust. And so this I co-wrote with a mutual friend of ours, Phil Jones. And it's really about the way you can use content as a tool to earn trust, that it can serve as evidence of the claims that you're making. And, again, it's funny. These books were written before my diagnosis, but I can now see it, sort of shaded all over them. This idea that the constant search for the truth, of understanding who's telling the truth and who's not, of needing to see the explanation, the background of things to fully understand it.
Mm.
The
Oh
book
my
is really a
gosh.
tool, right?
Right? Once you sell me with information that I can trust and buy, you'll have me. If you
Yep.
can't sell me, I may never be with you. I
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because it's one of those things where, again, after I got my diagnosis, I had this experience of like reliving my whole life in retrospect and seeing all the things that I didn't know what they were at the time, the signs.
Mm,
One of
mhm.
them is that I have been called difficult at times because I have a lot of follow-up questions. Now, you could say that this is why I got into journalism because I had permission to ask lots of nosy questions.
Oh,
But with
yeah.
this new understanding, this lens is I need more context to wrap my head around ideas, that I don't do well with uncertainty and unknowns. And so my follow up questions are not me questioning you and your intelligence. It's me having a mad libs that I need to fill in some blanks for before I could wrap my head around an idea. So it's funny how in retrospect, you start to see a lot of things that you didn't see before.
Oh my gosh. I've laughed way too loudly there because, oh my gosh, I will have more questions by an exponential factor than
Mhm.
somebody else. They'll be like, okay, I'm good. I'm like, no, 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 no. But we're buying a sofa right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like, but there's the corner cushions. Are they set up so that it's an L joint, or are they
Yeah.
diagonal cushions so that, right? But I need to know that because if I want to take off one cushion, I need to know what that's going to look like. I
Exactly.
need to
If you
know if
wanna
it's color
cover.
fast fabric. I
Yeah.
need to know if it's cats proof. I need and it's really interesting because that all naturally comes up for me and out my
Mhm.
mouth. So when I go to see my doctors, I have a notebook and they're a little
Yep.
afraid because I now ask them to record the
Yep.
session, which
Love it.
that look at your doctor's face when you ask for that and
Yeah.
see how they react. That tells you a lot.
Yeah.
But I do that because I want the information. So I depend on the information.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny, I'm enjoying these moments where you're having these light bulb moments. I hope I'm not sending you into a swirling crisis of self here. But there's something they call the diagnostic domino effect, which is that
Mm.
what we find is people who are autistic, which I imagine people who are highly sensitive as well, we tend to subconsciously flock to one another because we experience the world the same way. We have the same limitations, like that event where you and I were both like, it's way too loud in here, like instantly bonded, right? So what happens oftentimes is one person will go about, they'll get diagnosed and then slowly start to realize, like, oh, these people that I've been drawn to, we share a lot of similar traits.
Yeah.
My mom got diagnosed after I did because in answering the questionnaire for me, she's like, well, I do that and I do that and I do that. I said, well, do I have some news for you, Mom? Guess what that means? So it definitely happens. It's an awareness thing, and I feel like as women, we're not we're not socialized to talk about these things because there's so much ableism in seeing things like autism or ADHD as a deficit rather than as a superpower or as just a way of thinking. We're not
Yeah.
taught to talk about it. So the more we do, the more we're sort of opening up that dialogue and allowing people to know themselves better, to get the support that they may need.
I love that point, and I'm thinking that perhaps because we have had very few women diagnosed in the scheme of things, we haven't
Hmm.
had role models to look for. I mean,
That's right.
who are they? Temple Grandin is the big one that comes to mind.
Hmm. Hannah
Then I think of,
Gadsby.
pardon me?
Hannah Gadsby is
Oh,
a
yeah. Oh, I didn't
yeah.
ask. Okay. It's like, duh, right?
It becomes a radar after a while.
Well, I follow, and we'll have on the show shortly as well, Ludmila Preslova. And
Hmm.
she's just, her book's coming out on April 23rd, 2024. And it's called The Canary Code. And she's
Hmm.
talking about autism and neurodiversity and all of this. And I'm a loud fan of hers. I'm a loud fan
Hmm.
of yours. And
Yeah.
I'm realizing, yes, I've been called to connect to the people that I've figured out or are drawn to as being highly sensitive, like David Bowie, Annie
Hmm.
Lennox, like the
Hmm.
icons. How do you refer to autism and yourself? What language do you like to
Yes,
use? Because I've heard there's a whole discussion
there's two.
around this. Hmm.
Yes, there is. So there's two schools of thought here. One is called person first language. This is often used by people outside of the neurodiversity community to say a person with autism, to sort of separate the two, that this is a person and they have autism in the same way that they have a cold or have cancer, right? That it's this separate thing. And then there is like the language that says I am autistic. I'm an autistic person because for me, those things are inseparable. You can't take the autism out of me and still have me. It's different, right? We're intrinsically linked. And that's preferred by 83% of the autistic community prefers to use that language to say autistic person or I'm autistic rather than I have autism. Now, the one
Oh,
caveat I
thank
make
you.
here is that grammatically, sometimes you have to do that. I can't say, as I began to learn more about autisticness, right? Like in some cases, you do have to use autism as the noun that it is, but
Mm.
for most autistic adults, the vast majority, 83%, prefer autistic adult than person with autism.
Thank you for sharing that because
Yeah.
I've had the perception that in this evolution of language,
Hmm.
that there's been a level of feeling like we're respecting the community to say it's a person with autism rather than
Right.
Melanie is autistic, right?
Right. And
So, yeah.
it's so challenging because a lot of it has been for the vast majority of the history of autism, as we've been studying it, learning about it, it has been non-autistics who are doing the advocacy. It's been non-autistics who are doing
Mhm,
the research, non-autistics who are teaching and talking about it.
mhm,
And now that thanks to, the breadth of technology that's been democratized, it's the
mm.
first time in history that we've seen so many autistics self-advocating, that we're able to speak up for ourselves and say the language we prefer and how we think about ourselves, how we talk, how we think. And it's not perhaps parents of autistic children that are speaking on their behalf. Um, Again, part of that is also the nonverbal folks who may never have had a chance to speak up for themselves now have assistive devices that allow them to express themselves and have their voices heard. So it's a big part of why I think it's so important for me specifically. I know we've talked about this. I feel a responsibility in a way because I know that I have this platform that I'm able to speak, I'm able to write, and it feels like something that I need to talk about because if someone had talked about it sooner for me, I would have learned and had the accommodations that I need, the confidence, the self-knowledge much, much sooner. So I'm hoping that by talking about it more publicly, I can help other folks come to that realization sooner.
Love it. And this is why we're aligned. So
Hmm.
I'm going to come to the HSP quiz that you were talking about. Or I want to come to that, but I
Yeah.
want to just say that it really resonates with me, this feeling that I have a skill as well about speaking and
Hmm.
communicating. And I think this is why I'm doing the podcast,
Yeah.
because I think that this is using a skill that I have to have impact. And I realize that, so in the world of generally introversion and extroversion is kind of split. In the highly sensitive world, introversion is 70%, extroversion is 30%. I don't know in
Mhm.
autism. I'm imagining it's even more potentially towards introversion. Would it
So
be?
it depends. My guess would be toward introversion. I don't have the data offhand, but what I do know, and again, it's a spectrum, is that
Mhm.
most autistic people, because we experience excessive stress compared to the average person in social scenarios, we do typically find solitary experiences or experiences with like a few close, safe people to be more energizing and sort of healing and resetting than being in a large social situation, just because it requires so much more effort just to exist in those spaces.
And you're safe on stage. So
Hmm.
tell me about that.
Yeah.
Well, that's still with thousands of people,
It's
but
so
safe.
it's so funny because I joke now again that in retrospect, I see so many things. And I joke that I've told on myself so many times about being autistic before I knew that I was telling on myself.
Mm,
I have always said that I have difficulty in sort of networking environments. The 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 1 is challenging for me because I'm unsure of the structure of the conversation. Textbook autistic experience. When I am on stage, the context is very clear to me. I know what my job is. My job is to speak. No one's going to interrupt me unless they're given a structured opportunity to do so about a topic that I already know what it is.
right.
And so in those environments, I'm clear on the rules and I can fall into that role. Um, it's the same reason why now, speaking of accommodations, I typically ask to be put on the schedule earlier in the event. Because if I speak early, everyone who comes up to me after we have a shared context. You're coming up to talk about my talk, about a topic that I know. You're
Yeah.
not going to ask me, so what do you do? And I won't know what to say. Or, why are you here? And I won't know what to say. It
Yeah.
gives a shared context for all the conversations that follow. So that's a very easy adjustment that has now made me more personable, more effective, and honestly, it's better for everyone because we're able to get more out of that experience when I can speak first and give a broader context for the conversation.
I love that. The reason for everyone who's listening, I hit my head then with an aha moment because of Melanie. Sorry, I'm throwing so much at you while you're talking.
I love it.
Um, I recently spoke for Disrupt HR and I
Hmm.
asked to go first. I asked to go first, not thinking about the shared context, which I really love. I
Hmm.
asked to go first because I didn't want to be sitting there influenced by everything, all the thoughts that would come into my head watching
Hmm.
everybody else, which would be really distracting from arriving, being outside, coming in, a little bit of saying hello to people, and then centering and being ready to
Yeah.
deliver. I like a quiet green room. I don't
Yep.
want other input coming in,
Hmm.
right? So I
Yeah.
asked to go first. Does that resonate with you at all? That
Oh yeah, 100%. Um, and there's a million little things like that I joke. I mean, a lot of times people will say, like, you lived your whole life without this diagnosis. Why did it matter? What difference does it make? Right. It's not like
Yeah.
I'm in school and I'm getting extra test taking time or something like that. Because I work for myself. It's not like I necessarily need workplace accommodations from a boss.
Mm.
Um, for me, it has allowed me to identify places where I am struggling because I'm not accommodating myself. Um, that's one example, right? I thought I was
Mm.
bad at networking. I'm not. I'm just autistic. And if I can make some adjustments, that becomes easier for me. Another example, I've lived my whole life believing that I'm scared of crowds, that crowds make me anxious, that I'm scared in crowds. I'm not. I'm autistic in crowds. And if I wear my headphones, I am perfectly fine. I had no
Oh,
idea. I was
really?
overstimulated. There was too much noise, and that was making me feel stressed, not the number of people. The amount of noise is what I was struggling with. And when I wear my headphones at the airport now, I'm cool as a cucumber. I love to travel now.
What about, okay, so I can do crowds where there's lots of people around, but if they're close in space and I'm getting
Hmm.
crushy,
Yeah.
I really want to have nothing to do that. We were in Luxembourg and we went to they have this beautiful carnival, Schuberfour, and there's
Hmm.
fireworks at the end of it. And we went to watch the fireworks and getting out of the firework locations. I'm the kind of person who'll be like, how easy is it to get out of here? Therefore, that's where
Hmm.
I place myself and park. Well, I
Hmm.
wasn't directing where we were going. So we
Hmm.
ended up in a place that took us an hour to get out of the crowd.
Yeah.
And I go through a lot of stress when my
Yeah.
personal space is not respected.
100%. So I mean, that could absolutely be, sort of run-of-the-mill anxiety or
Mhm.
claustrophobia or something else. But
Mm.
the way I like to think of it is people who are autistic tend to have overactive senses, which means we smell smells stronger, we feel things stronger. An itchy tag in your shirt is not just an inconvenience, it prevents you from focusing, right? Like
Yeah,
it's
the princess and the
amplified.
pea story, right? Right?
Exactly,
We
right?
can
She
sense
she was
that
probably
pea under the
she wasn't
mattress,
a diva, she was probably just autistic. Uh,
right?
but
Yeah.
what it is, the way I think about it is, it's like a cup being filled with liquid. If I am coming from a place where I am fully regulated, I've had my headphones, then I'm fine. I can handle a little bit of stress, a little bit of claustrophobia, a little bit of crowd, in my space. If it's also way too loud and it smells very strongly and I haven't had something to eat in the last couple hours and my stomach's getting a little grumbly,
Oh, yeah.
and the wristband that they made me wear to get into the crowd is a little too tight and making me itchy, it fills the cup and it overflows, right? And that's why I think it's so important to be able to identify the way you react to those senses and to be able to accommodate yourself. Because, as a speaker, I travel for work. I have to travel. That's what I do. But now I can do it without being stressed, without being as overstimulated, without
Mm.
being as anxious going into it. And that meaningfully changes not just the travel experience, but my outlook on work, my willingness to do my work, my comfort when I arrive somewhere. So
Mhm.
understanding those things and being able to prevent those other extra drops from filling the cup, it, for me anyway, increases my threshold.
Exactly. Yeah. So many things. Oh my gosh. I've left a conference because it was too loud. After I
Mhm.
drove 14 hours to go. Like
Right.
the hotel was too loud, couldn't go. I've been at the front desk of a resort where they want you to make a wristband, wear a wristband. And I'm like, I don't want to wear a wristband for an entire week. Plus, it
Mhm.
ruins the photos. I want it on my foot. And I've had a loud disagreement, like a persistent, I wouldn't
Mhm.
say loud, I would say persistent argument to try and be accommodated to have this thing on my wrist.
Mhm.
Or my leg. I will throw my leg up in the air to show the person I'm walking by
Yeah.
rather than have this thing on my wrist.
And it's so hard to advocate for yourself. At least that's what I found. It's hard to advocate for yourself when you feel like it's just a preference, right? When it's like, well,
Yeah.
I'd prefer not to have it on. That people are loath to accommodate. They don't care about your preferences. We got policies, right? But
Yeah.
if you can walk up and say, or if I could walk up and say, I'm beside you and I say, hey, I'm autistic and I have a really hard time with constricting things around my wrist. Is it possible for me to put that around my ankle instead? So
Yes.
much more likely to accommodate you, right? Just because of the
100%.
approach is different.
Yeah. This is why my big mission is to say, never mind the labels. And so I want to back in from that to
Yeah.
understanding diagnosis, which is,
Mhm.
you mentioned a quiz or an assessment, something. So
Yeah.
help me because so many light bulbs are going off for me. I'm so firmly highly sensitive and I'm very curious about this.
Yeah. So diagnosis happens in a lot of different ways. What we find is that 80% of autistic women are typically undiagnosed still by the age of 18. So the vast majority of autistic women are undiagnosed, are unaware.
Yeah.
And all the reasons that contribute to that, from the social factors to we have more care responsibilities, it's harder to take care of yourself, to we're making less money, it's harder to get, we're not maybe in control of our healthcare access.
Yeah.
All of those things impact it, as well as, hopefully you have a healthcare provider who's willing to listen to you and make an appropriate referral, which is
Yeah.
additionally more difficult for women.
Yeah. On your point of
So,
care,
yeah.
I stopped at 2 children because I knew I would be overwhelmed with more.
Hmm.
In fact, 2 was
Yeah.
plenty overwhelming at once. And I was like, "No, no, 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 no. We know
Yeah.
that the hormones were telling me 3, but I was
Yeah.
like, no, 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 no. You cannot cope with being
Yeah.
outnumbered as a parent.
Hmm.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can't." So, yeah, sorry.
Absolutely.
So, okay,
So
so 80% of women are undiagnosed at
so
until
of
18.
At 18. So a very typical funnel for adult autistic women that end up being diagnosed is that they're taking a child for assessment because there is a genetic factor.
Yeah,
So oftentimes, very often, a woman will have one or two children, one or the other starts exhibiting symptoms of autism or some similar delay or
mm,
neurodivergence. And during that assessment process, they do what my mom did, which is they're filling out the paperwork and they go, well, I do that. Well, I've always done that. That's how I do it. And it's a light bulb moment for hopefully their healthcare provider to say, let's look into this a bit more.
mhm.
Um, For that reason, because of the challenges and the difficulties of getting diagnosed as a woman, but especially if you're gender nonconforming or a person of color, where those diagnoses are even less commonly given,
Mm.
um, self-diagnosis is typically accepted within the autistic community. Now, that's not universal, of course. People have different opinions, but if you are the type of person that is prone to uh, resonating with a lot of these things, that these things are resonating with you. You're
Only
not just
like
going to
only a
go,
a lot.
we're not the type to read a single article and go, oh, that's me for sure.
No.
No, you're going to do a deep dive. You're going to take every online assessment out there. You're going to read 16 books by autistic women to see if it resonates with you. By the time you are sure enough to say, I believe I am autistic, you're sure. It wasn't an offhanded decision, right? Because of the way that our minds work as autistic women. So that's typically accepted, especially for women, people who are gender nonconforming or people of color. But if you do want to go for a formal assessment, it's
Mhm.
typically something the healthcare systems are different, obviously, US and Canada, but
Mhm.
at least here in the US, your general practitioner, your main healthcare provider will refer you to a specialist who does those types of assessments, with the caveat that it is difficult to find people who are skilled at assessing adult women because, as we've already established, there's very little research. There's not many people who are skilled at doing this. And even skilled professionals don't know all of the signs in women because there hasn't been as much research done. So advocate for yourself. Do some research to find people who are skilled at doing this with adult women in particular. It may take longer.
Mhm.
You may have to travel further for it if you're able to, but typically that's the process to getting a more formal diagnosis.
Yeah. And what really strikes me is if you're in the working world,
Hmm.
accommodations are so very much tied to the medical model of disability.
Yes.
And I don't necessarily agree with putting autism in disability
Yeah.
or
I think it is.
disorder.
I think it's fair.
Yeah, disability can be, right?
Hmm.
Depending
Oh, it's
on,
absolutely disabling. 100%.
yeah. So if what I want to hope can be expanded is the invitation to have what we need, whether we've yet been able to get a diagnosis
Right.
or not. So to decouple it from that medical model.
Absolutely. Because as we're saying here, like there are people who maybe don't meet the criteria for a diagnosis, but still very much have sound sensitivity that disrupts their ability to do their work. Diagnosis of anything aside, to your point about, forgetting the labels. So it's
Yeah.
really important. And I also find that, at least in my anecdotal conversations, this is not, researched, backed up data, but anecdotally, I have found people saying that they're finding workplaces more likely to have those conversations about accommodation because the broader conversation about neurodiversity is
Mhm.
more common now. We're talking about it more openly. So someone, 10 years ago, if you said to your boss, I'm a highly sensitive person, I have sound
Mhm.
sensitivity or sensory processing issues, I
Mhm.
need to wear headphones. The reaction would probably be, you think you can listen to music at work when nobody else can? Like it
Right.
wouldn't be receptive.
Right.
Now, people generally have a broader understanding. As a society, there's an understanding that people do have different sensitivities and that these things actually increase productivity as opposed to decrease. So, hopefully,
Yeah.
whether you have that access to a formal diagnosis or not, hopefully you're able to get those accommodations as long as you know you need them. That's always the challenge, right? If you don't know why you're not productive at work, you
Yeah.
don't know why you can't focus, it's harder to ask for that.
100%. I think we're still in emerging territory
Hmm.
there, and it's going to be individual awareness and
Right.
company policies have to relax a lot because I've
Yeah.
heard out of the mouth of executives, oh, we have a process for accommodations, and I
Hmm.
know it's tied to a doctor's note.
Yeah. Which is a
So
shame, especially when we consider, the diagnostic challenges.
yeah,
Those policies disproportionately hurt women, people of color, gender
right,
nonconforming people
right,
who are less likely to get the health care they need to begin with, never mind the social
yeah.
stigmas attached to an
Yeah, so
autism diagnosis.
self-diagnosis is not going to help a lot of people here
Yeah.
in this particular community until that mindset shift and openness happens.
Hmm.
And so you mentioned, a general practitioner could refer you to a specialist,
Yep.
and to be seen by that specialist, is there a financial investment? I imagine there is.
Yes.
So that's
Yeah.
why I have the hashtag diagnosis is privilege, because
It
certainly for
absolutely is.
ADHD diagnoses, there's a very long wait time here
Oh yeah.
in
Same for
Canada.
autism. Yeah.
Saying, I would
And
imagine this, yeah,
And again, that's especially true for women when there are fewer professionals who are skilled at diagnosing it in adult women. So I think I waited 9 months from my official submission to when I
Mm,
actually had my day in the office.
yeah,
Now, during that time, I was doing a lot of soul searching and reading and researching,
yeah,
and so I walked in feeling like it was a formality. I'm very blessed to live in an area that has a lot of medical research facilities, so it
yeah,
was not something that was cost prohibitive for me because of the sheer amount of professionals in my local area.
yeah,
Um, the Raleigh-Durham area in North Carolina is known as the Research Triangle. So there's a ton of medical research happening here. So very lucky to have that as a resource very close. But yeah, absolutely. The cost is going to depend on, your access to healthcare. It's going to depend on, at least in the US, your insurance,
yeah,
whether that's someone that you can go to within your coverage or you have to go outside of those bounds. And there are some people who offer it privately, even if you're not covered under insurance or they're not within your network. I've heard costs ranging from several hundred to several thousand, just depending on
yeah.
who those professionals are and how you can access them. So it's absolutely a privilege to have a formal diagnosis and just, I think, underscores why self-diagnosis is so accepted in the
Mhm.
community.
Yeah, no, brilliant. You're so helping my understanding here. I want to come back to the area of your strength.
Hmm.
One of the areas of your strength, your creativity and the ability to really create. And what I said before we started, finish projects, actually have
Hmm.
two produced books behind you, whereas I have
Yeah.
50,000 words of one that's just on my computer. And I've been nurturing another for a year, which
Yeah.
I'm really excited about. But tell me about the connection you make between autism and this brilliant talent you have.
So for me, the way being autistic impacts me, it impacts the way I think primarily.
Mhm.
I am a systems thinker. I find the links between things. I recognize patterns. I have to see how things are connected,
Yep.
which is why I'll show it here for those who are looking, and I'll describe it for those who are listening. But my first book is essentially a matrix. It's a 10 by 10 grid. That's the system, right?
Yep.
I literally put out a book that's a 10 by 10 matrix because that's how I think. That's how I answer the question, where do the ideas come from? They come from a system, and here it is, right?
And why
So,
when I read it, I was like, uh-huh, yeah, that makes complete sense. And I need a picture. I need
hmm
a picture for
I'm a
everything.
very, very
Yeah, we were
visual
talking
thinker.
about we're planning to go to Long Beach. I'm speaking in April in Long Beach.
Yeah.
And then oh, sorry, this is the Bali trip. We're planning to go to Bali in September. And how
Uh-huh.
many days do we want to spend in Tokyo before we get to Bali? And we've got a night flight and so on. I'm like, I need the picture. I need the calendar.
Hmm.
I can't hold this in my
Yep.
head. I need to hmm,
Yeah, so it's that systems thinking for me. Again, I didn't do this intentionally because I had no idea that this was a superpower, so to speak, at that time. But
mhm,
um, part of the reason I think I went into journalism initially was because my job was to go into situations that were unknown and abstract, to ask all the right questions, and then present that information in a way that was easy for people to understand. I then went into teaching. I do curriculum development. Same thing. I'm taking these abstract ideas, I'm organizing them and presenting them in a way that's easy to understand. All my books, the same thing. The work I do with clients when they say, look, I have this idea. I know it's IP, but I haven't figured out what it's called. Can you
yeah.
help me model this idea and then brand it as intellectual property, right? I'm taking
That's
the
so
abstract,
fun.
making it tangible, and putting it in an easy to digest form. So I'm taking my visual mind and putting it down on paper. And so much of my work is that. So much of the way I work is that.
Yeah.
Uh, this is part of why, for me, saying that I have autism or that it's somehow separate from me feels impossible because the way I think, act, work, do, it's all driven by that way of thinking.
Well, I'm just thinking now of the people who are listening to this conversation.
Hmm.
And if they're like me, they're feeling excited, empowered,
Hmm.
curious, perhaps more
Hmm.
curious, especially if you're highly sensitive out there. And what a
Hmm.
lot of what Melanie has said has resonated with you. I see a lot of AUHD now,
Hmm.
but
Yes.
I still don't see a lot of talk in the neurodivergent community around high sensitivity and
Hmm.
around this where are we? So I think the point that you made, which is really landing for me, is it's binary. Either you are or you aren't.
That's
So
true.
that's a point of inquiry that I need to follow personally. And
Hmm.
I wonder if there aren't a lot of highly sensitive people who really want to answer that question to understand. For
I
me,
think so.
the area where I've tripped up over it and said, "Oh, I don't think that's me," is because I think socially I
Mhm.
can feel pretty comfortable, but I wonder if that isn't from having had 10 schools growing up and having moved so much, I had to figure it out.
Hmm.
Because the first many, many, many moves, I didn't feel comfortable. It's only
Yeah.
now that I can, 30, 40 years
So
old, probably feeling it.
So one of the things I'll share, obviously, again, just because you have one or two of these things that resonates with you is not anyone, me included, saying you have
Mm,
autism, right? That's
mhm.
different for everyone.
Yeah.
There are really reliable online tests, including the RAADS-R, so RADSR, is an online test you can take. Again, it's not going to give you a certificate of any kind, but if you're
Mhm.
doubting yourself, that could be a good place to start. There are other assessments as well to look for that can help give you more of an idea of, does this resonate with me? Does it feel similar? Um, the other thing is that if this is not, if pursuing this information is not going to make you feel whole, if it's not something that you think will be additive to your life, there's no law that says you have to. If you're comfortable identifying as highly sensitive, if you're comfortable identifying as quiet, as introverted, as an INTJ, like whatever floats your boat,
Yeah.
it's more about you feeling whole and having the
Yeah.
information you need. But I think if you were to find out this information about yourself, the most important thing to remember is that this is who you always have been. Nothing has changed. You are exactly who you have been. You are good at all of the things you were good at before. The only thing that can come from this internally is to understand yourself better and make life easier for you. So don't feel like this is not a health diagnosis. This is a discovery. It has always been there if that's the case. And so you will only be learning more about yourself. And my personal experience with this and a lot of other late diagnosed women is that it can be transformative in the most freeing, beautiful way to know yourself in a way you never have before. So if that is exciting to you, please do follow research, reach out to me if I could be helpful, send any resources, I'm happy to. But I often say that I think that a lot of women who would call themselves type A, the A probably stands for autism.
Way too much gold here. Melanie, thank you so much. I want to end on that real invitation and acceptance all in the same breath.
Mhm,
This has been very enlightening for me
mhm.
personally. And I think for our listeners, it will be too. We will put in the show notes how you can find Melanie online and connect with her. I believe that it's been a richness in my life ever since I met you. And I'm thrilled to continue to know you and discover more about you and be along with you in your journey. So thanks everyone for listening. Melanie, I'm going to ask you, would you be, if people want to reach out to you, what is the best way that they could actually connect with you? What's your preference?
So I'm on social wherever you can find me. I always caution that my LinkedIn inbox is absolutely inundated with spam, so probably not your best chance for being seen. But you can find me on Instagram, on Threads, and my email and contact form are available on my website, which is just my name, melaniedeziel.com. So if you look for me, you should be able to find me.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, everyone look for Melanie and let us know if this episode really resonated with you. And yeah, if you learned something, if you're going to do something, if you're just going to feel better, let us know how it resonated. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much, Melanie, for every minute that you spent with me.
And thank you for making me feel seen.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for listening. You can find all of the Happy Space podcast episodes over at happyspacepod.com. I love learning what resonates with you, so please leave a comment about this episode over social media, or even better, post a review wherever you tune in. And if you have an idea for a topic to explore or an inclusive action to celebrate, I would love to know more about it. It might even appear in an upcoming episode or an issue of the Happy Space newsletter. Please help me spread the word about people doing great things. After all, doesn't everyone deserve a happy space?